Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel warm just looking out and seeing people with wine glasses. I don't know that I've given a lecture with wine, but it does make me feel quite comfortable. Okay, great. I do want to thank Mark for his persistence. I think he reached out to me when we thought we were coming out of the COVID curve, and I was like, yeah, I'm not so sure. And so we decided to wait. So it's been 3 years in the making to come here to GSA, and so I'm very delighted that you kept asking and that we were finally able to make the time and space to do so. And I also just want to thank Mark's team for shepherding me here through emails and paperwork and all of that, and just making me feel very at home even before I arrived. And I want to thank the faculty and students who allowed me to sit in and actually opine on their work. I have to say, I did it over 2 days, and the very first day just blew me away, and I was just so inspired by the work that I saw all the students do, and the prompts of the units were super fascinating. So to see how they were kind of enacted as a way to inspire you around your very specific interests seems to work really, really well. I'm very inspired by it, and just really delighted to see the depth of research that you all have amassed in such a short period of time in your semester at the mid-semester break. So thank you for that. So Mark has asked me to spend a little bit of time talking about myself and my work. So I'm going to just sort of walk us through a couple of stories that I hope resonate with you all and the work that you're doing. As Mark said, I've been on the ground since Sunday night, really hit the ground on Monday, and I've had the pleasure of having a number of people spend a really generous amount of time with me, walking me through the city, taking me to lectures and events and great food. So every day I would come back and tweak this presentation that I'm about to share with you, just to see if I can draw threads from, again, what you inspired in me and things that I saw. So the future we cannot yet see is my talk. So for the last 5 years or so, my work has been very steeped in land. It's like, of course it is. You're an architect, urban designer, planner. That's like not new news or obvious. But my work is predominantly based in the United States, and it's predominantly based in what I'll call contested cities. They're in cities, larger U.S. cities or mid-sized cities that have a number of different histories of contest, usually around urban renewal, urban removal, gentrification, things that continually show up and affecting the same populations of people with the same kind of geography. And these are typically Black and brown people and low-income people. So the idea of my work over the last 5 years and being asked to come in and work with cities and community organizations and foundations is all centered on sites that sort of look like this, and not just a single site, but an entire neighborhood or an entire side of town. And so when you keep being asked to work on the same type of issues across different cities, you begin to ask yourself very broader questions. And for me, in order for me to stay energized and hopeful about this work, it also requires me to find different ways of getting into the work to try to be disruptive. Mainstream futurist discourse tends to extrapolate from the status quo and propose singular, predetermined future visions. The problem with a lot of such foresight is that it is bound by the constraints and suppositions of dominant perceptions of reality. Within the protopia framework, however, we position that there is no singular future trajectory, but rather a vast scope of many alternative futures. It is continuously shaped not just by our actions, but also by our inactions and our apathy. Protopia, a term that I discovered a few years ago by a guy, Kevin Kelly, says that the concept was initially inspired by a word, paranoia, the opposite of paranoia, an exuberant feeling that the world is rooting for you. And every time I say that word, I get incredibly emotional. Because what does it feel like? What would it feel like if the entire world were rooting for you? Let's take that in for a second. So I became so powerfully inspired by this. I try to push it into all of my work. And it actually gives me a sense of hopefulness in spaces that often do not have a lot of hope and or are just really hard to redress. This work is very hard to do. So, Protopias. I'm reminded by a number of things. I've been around the city for a few days. This is my second time in Joburg. People have drawn the map of the city for me and its origins. I've seen it in tour maps from Lemon Pebble. Mark drew it on a napkin yesterday at lunch. You know, you're inspired. The spatial composition of this city is inspired by a utopian vision, right? The Garden City by Ebenezer Howard in the early 1900s. At the same time, W.E.B. Du Bois was documenting Black life in America. So the image that you see on the left is his assessed value of Black-owned land in Georgia, 1900. The graphics to me are stunning. These are infographics. This is data that he's collecting in 1900 and documenting in this amazingly beautiful infographic way. Interesting that it's radio. We don't often see, you see pie charts. They don't kind of look like this. But to me, the assessed value of Black-owned land in Georgia is a protopian proposition against at a time when a utopian vision is being drafted and that decades later your city is founded upon. So I became very interested in the ways in which African Americans were thinking about, maybe they weren't calling it protopia at the time, maybe they were calling it utopia, but these visions of a hopefulness starts to seep into my thought and my curiosity to explore. As I've been doing some work and looking at Black migration patterns. So I'm from Chicago. One of the projects I'm going to show you is in the neighborhood where my dad grew up. And I know that his trajectory and my mother's trajectory to Chicago are from the first and second waves of the Great Migration, where African Americans are moving from the agrarian South to the industrial North, as shown here in Aaron Douglas's painting of 1936, Aspiration. So on the south side of Chicago, and this is a snippet of the south side of Chicago, where Blacks were migrating through that pattern I just showed you to what was known as the Black Belt. So they were moving above the Mason-Dixon line to less restrictive, less Jim Crow regulated cities, states, and towns, but they were still regulated through racial covenants and through other real estate discriminatory practices to live in a certain part of the South Side, which was called the Black Belt. In that space of exclusion, great wealth by African Americans was formed. Between 1920 and 1950, Chicago's Black metropolis, as it was known, was home to immense wealth. First Black bank, first Black insurance company, first Black publishing company, doctors, lawyers, engineers, all living amongst laborers and folks who worked at the slaughterhouses and the steel mills. It was the classic mixed income community. All African American. Over 330,000 residents, over 2,600 Black businesses, with a spending purchasing power of $150 million. That's a lot of spending money. That drives an economy, yeah? So fast forward to 2020, the Harvard, I had agreed in 2019 to write an article for the Harvard Design magazine on Publix. We get to 2020, the world collapses with the pandemic. And then a few months later in the United States, the murder of George Floyd. And my article was due. And I literally could not find words to write about publics. I was very disinterested in telling histories that were in numerous books that anyone could pick up. Didn't feel like that was my job to do. Also didn't want to relive telling a history that I know very well, my family has experienced, to other people, because the texts were already there. So I really was struggling with any kind of language, written language, for writing an article. These issues of vacant land reoccurring in the different cities that I was working in. The fact that I knew, because my family was from the South Side and from this area, and I knew the history of this place, but I was often meeting with people who had lived in these neighborhoods of vacancy for multiple generations who were very disconnected from that history. Just as I, as an African-American woman, am disconnected from my history on this continent. So all they knew is all they saw. And I couldn't figure out how to communicate the gap in the narrative of this land. And so land narratives became an incredible and burning fascination to me. I was watching a documentary about Black artists, and I was inspired by that. And this is, again, the pandemic, so I didn't really have anywhere to go. And we were all binge watching all sorts of interesting things. And after that documentary, I pulled out paper, scissors, a glue stick, and my laptop, and I started collaging. I just started aggressively finding these images of the Black wealth, joy story that I knew existed on this land. And I started matching it up against the images of today and the narratives that people keep wanting to tell about this neighborhood. And I was really hell-bent on trying to tell the joy story and to juxtapose it against today so that I can force a different conversation about a future. So I ended up penning a article for the Harvard Design magazine called Southside Land Narratives. And it was an essay where I was questioning what was once made available to African Americans migrating from the South to the North 100 years ago was ultimately a false promise of the available city. Disrupting Black space through public takings, disrupting Black space through racial violence, and disrupting Black space through predatory extraction was the predominant narrative. And during that period after George Floyd and this awakening of the inequities and disparities against Black bodies in the United States, people wanted to know more. So these histories were the only histories kind of surfacing, not our histories of joy and love and survival and resilience and innovation. And I was desperate to put those kind of narratives in the room. But it also required me to unpack more of the history, understanding that in fact, there were real resistance to African Americans in the free North. There was the great white city that was on the grounds of Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace, where there were protesters, white protesters, and this is the 50s and 60s, who were not wanting African Americans in the amusement park. There were African Americans marching on the public beaches, demanding access without violence. Underlying that, though, is that Black joy story, those 26,000 Black businesses, youth being able to play in an Olmsted Park, the first Black insurance company, Ebony and Jet magazine started by John Johnson, the first Black publishing company still here today, the birth of house music. Just checking to see if you guys call yourselves the birth of house music too. And just, these expressions of Black liberation and freedom and joy that never get talked about, that never get validated, that never get seen on equal footing with other languages and expressions of goodness and joy. What was happening, though, is investments in stewardship of vacant land. Let's do urban farms and gardens, and let's paint murals. That's all very, very good. But it never crossed the line of that sort of temporary investment. Yet I still kept coming back to finding places of joy and inspiration, kernels of Black modernist architecture that started in the 50s. African-American painters from Chicago who were using languages and histories in their work all the way to the portraits of the Obamas. All of these things were sort of swirling in my head, so I think you can kind of see how I couldn't write this without a visual, and we're all visual thinkers in this room. So what ultimately came to be over the course of maybe like 2 days was this prolific creation of collages. And I've seen several collages from students in this room that have blown me away and blow these away, quite honestly. But as a methodology to think through complex issues of design and histories and narratives, it's such an amazing tool. So I was really happy to see students using it here because it allowed me to create a visual narrative of the juxtaposition of a current and a past and an aspiration and relationships between those histories and narratives that you can't write in a text through 3 or 4 paragraphs, that you need an instant way to see things in a different way. A march for land reparations, taking the march that was on the beach. What would it look like if we march for our rights for land on a carpet of Michelle Obama's dress from her portrait? What would it look like if we confronted the white protesters who wouldn't allow us in the Olmsted Park with the old school house picnic house party that happens every year in that park? So I'm going to talk to you and unpack my work a little bit through 4 parts. The first part is the future informed by a past. So it's me and my mommy and my dad. They'd be so proud of hearing that introduction, by the way. So my parents, my dad was actually born in Chicago, even though his family was from Mississippi. My mom was born in Arkansas, moved to Chicago when she was 2. And I was born in the neighborhood you're going to see in a second and lived there till I was 2 years old. And then we moved to the far south side, which was more newly developed into our own townhouse. We were living with my dad's grandmother at the time. So they were a young couple who just got this 3-bedroom, 2-story townhouse cooperative beginning their life. But because as things opened up from that Black Belt, Blacks just continued to migrate to southern neighborhoods of the city. So the city remains fairly racially segregated north and south. And so I went to elementary school and high school mostly with people who look like me. My neighbors look like me. My teachers look like me. Where we shopped looked like me. That was my normal. The only place I didn't know I was normal is when I watched television and someone was telling me that I wasn't. But my experience as a little middle-class Black kid growing up on the south side of Chicago felt very, very normal to me. There were, I think, 2 white children in this class. Can anyone? I've shown you a picture of me, so can anyone pick me out? No? Yes? Ding. And I love this picture because I've always been really tall. And if they still do grade school pictures when you're standing on the stadium steps, I'm always on the top with the boys, the only girl. I used to hate that. So I love this picture because for some reason we were all sitting at desk and I got in the front row. So I was super excited. I decided I wanted to be an architect when I was 14. So things flip. And this becomes my environment to this day for the most part. So I'm in an architecture class at the University of Notre Dame, 47 of us, 7 women, 3 people of color. I'm barely visible because I'm in the shadow of the door, but there I am. And so migrating into architecture, into my career, this would be my professional space, right? There are about 115 or 20,000 licensed architects in the United States. 2% of them are African American. Just over 500 are Black women, of which I am proud to be one. I don't practice anymore, but I'm proud to have my stamp. So it's still a fairly white profession. Happily, it is more diverse by gender, which is wonderful. But it's been fairly flat in the United States in that, younger graduates of architecture schools are not moving into professional practice. They're leaving and doing other things. So that 120,000 number has been fairly consistent over the last 10, 15 years, which is really fascinating. And perhaps I'm a product of that, because the rest of this is going to tell you my arc of why I'm not a practicing architect anymore. But I've built buildings in London and Barcelona and in the United States. My last project was in Detroit, Michigan. It was the repositioning of a John Portman building when General Motors headquarters moved into downtown Detroit and purchased it. And this was a really pivotal moment because I was running our Detroit office and we were doing the design work, and General Motors had a developer manager, Heinz Development. And so we would do these amazing schemes and designs and present them at models, and we present them to Heinz and GM. And then we would go away and they would decide what scheme they were going to take. Of course, we wanted to influence that, and we did in our presentations. But it's not the architect's decision to decide. You're not spending the money. They are. And the city was involved too, because they needed certain permits. They were going to do some things on the riverfront. So it was the first time I realized the limitations in the agency of an architect, what you do and don't get to decide. And that there are other forces that shape the cities that we see. Private sector, developers, landowners, institutions, city government. We get to help advise them and give them ideas on what it looks like. But the decision about which direction to go, we're a bit limited in some ways. And I don't want to be super extreme about that, but at the scale that I was working, I was very fascinated by who was making decisions of who builds our cities. And there weren't people on that side that were trained like us. Right? So you've seen and can point to 10 horrible buildings that you've seen in your city, or 10 horrible urban conditions, spatial conditions. And have we asked ourselves, how did those come to be? It just wasn't an architect making that decision. It was a whole host of factors. I became very interested in being on the other side of that decision making. So my first pivot is into the public sector at this time, and I go and work in Washington, D.C., and later in Newark, New Jersey, as a deputy and then ultimately a planning director. We start working at this larger urban scale, where I had more agency in collaborating with architects alongside of me as my staff that I hired, as well as people we would hire as consultants, to really direct the direction of the city through a design excellence lens. Directing and working with Norman Foster and Heinz this time, where I'm at the table to direct design decisions and design guidelines of architecture, where I'm deciding on the land use policy and the development program of how much affordable housing we should put on a site that we own, and the selection of the developer and the designer. The allocation of public land that we own for public space, because this neighborhood didn't have it, and to design a design competition that would select a number of different architects and allow residents to be on the design jury. I got to decide that. And to work with a team of folks that would take infrastructure, this is a bridge that went over the river that we were taking down, and to move that also into a new public realm idea. I couldn't do that if I was just, and I don't want to say just, if I was a design consultant, I would have limited agency in how to make decisions about how to use public resources. So this was a really valuable time in my career, and I always recommend that designers, no matter what design discipline you're in, think about different sectors to work in if one of your goals is to have greater agency. But I'm also at this time recognizing now in this role of the public sector that I'm working in a city that has two tails. Washington, D.C. is a city that is the national capital of the United States, but it's also D.C., the city, the district. And it's deeply divided inequitably by unemployment, poverty, poor housing versus wealthy housing, and by race. At the top, if it's a darker color, it's a worse condition. On the bottom, The red is African American and the blue is white. And then the final racial dot map, you see where that divide is. And you can trace that back up to the black and white diagrams. So these social vulnerabilities are following racial patterns in the nation's capital. So I'm now kind of going, well, okay, I've solved for the agency of the designer. Now there are these deeply debated issues that I see in this city. And by the way, they parallel the city I grew up in, which is, why are things separated? Why are they separated by race? Why are they separated by income and other vulnerabilities? What is creating that? So also at this moment, I decide to teach. So I get my first position at Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I'll talk more about that later. So now I'm doing two things. Now I'm teaching and practice, and I'm in the public sector because I'm continuing to search for agency and answers in my work. So part two, for some, the pursuit of a future demands justice. So it's very important to me, language. Be impeccable with your words is one of the 4 agreements, one of my favorites. And if we're interested in this work of equity, inclusion, belonging, and we're working with people who are different from us, or we're just working in groups, it's important that we adopt the language, a shared language for the people we're seeking justice for. Does anybody know U.S. geography? You may want to take a stab at these cities. Mark can be the last to answer because he's vehemently shaking his head yes. But does anyone know these cities? And you can just call them out if you do. I showed you one. Chicago. Well, I showed you 2, actually. Chicago is the one on the... Okay. And I showed you the one on the other side. Okay. Anybody know the one in the middle? Which one? Detroit. And what's really interesting about this one, different from all the other ones, so see that horizontal line that divides blue and red here? And the horizontal line that divides blue and red here? That is the city boundary. And it's a street. And it does not have a wall. It does not have a fence. It does not have a berm. It does not have a rail. It does not have a highway. It is a literal street. So these geopolitical boundaries that separate us are fascinating, right, to look at. What city is this? It's you. Has anybody not seen this before? Yes? No? Yes? You have? Yes? Or no? Okay. So this is your racial dot map by density. And it's also really interesting because of the thickness of dots in certain areas. So it's not only sort of dividing you by race, but it's also sort of saying who lives in space with more breathing room and who doesn't. So let's get to language. Equity. We all say we want it. What is it? Oxford says it is the quality of being fair and impartial. But what is justice? So this was something I really had to unpack. And again, coming out of that 2000, and actually before, because in the US we have had a series of unfortunate killings of Black bodies, I would say, that every 4 or 5 years dust up a sort of question about what justice is, while you get a co-opting of the language in public spaces and philanthropic spaces that say, yeah, we want that too. But when you're in the room and asking your client and your community what it is, there's often not a clear answer. It's like, yeah, that's why we hired you to help us figure that out. So I wanted to really understand this more deeply. So there are a couple different kinds to talk about. There's distributive justice. Who gets what? Do we all have equal access to transportation? Do we all have equal access to healthy food? How are things distributed in and around our cities and neighborhoods equitably? or justly. Procedural justice. If you were to ask the average person on the street, which one of my classes did, they thought about it as the court system. So if one is about the distribution of fair share, this one is about the idea of fair play. Was the process fair? Restorative, sometimes called reparative. You might think that they are also distinct. But this is the one about either putting things back the way they were or repairing. And then one that was coined by Seth Lowe, who is an urban planner at the Graduate Center in New York, is interactional. The concept of interactional justice is about the quality of interpersonal interactions in a specific situation or place that includes truthfulness, respect, propriety, and justification. And I find this one really interesting because this one is saying our relationships to one another and how we are working collectively towards justice, equity, and inclusion starts with the truthfulness and respect of our relationship. So if that's not present and at the table, perhaps none of the other ones are possible. So these may not be either or propositions, or maybe sometimes you need one type, sometimes you need another. Oftentimes, maybe you need multiple ones to get at a notion of justice. I dug deep into scholars like Rawls and Iris Marion Young and David Harvey and Edward Soljan and Susan Feinstein to unpack it even further. Am I after a just outcome? Am I after a just process? Does a just outcome require a just process? Am I after a spatial justice? Am I after a social justice? And what does it mean to govern through a just policy, which is about our decision-making and the transparency of that decision-making? All of this is to say these are not simple words just to be thrown out and hope that we attain some sort of outcome around that aspiration. It requires us digging into what is it about justice that we're seeking or that we need? And is it justice that we need? So I come back to then racial equity, because in our country, we're also unpacking the distinction between equity and a racial equity. And the Government Alliance on Race and Equity defines it as racial equity is realized when race can no longer be used to protect life outcomes and outcomes for all groups are improved. And so because my work as a planner deals a lot in data, when I get to a point where the data indicators are not showing like those maps from DC, where the vulnerable social indicators track along race, in racial equity, that would no longer be the case. So because I like to be impeccable with my word, because I often work in communities that are different from me, because I often set tables that are with people from different sectors, different walks of life, different generations, different disciplinary fields, it's important that we sit around the table and have a set of shared values. So my lab created the Just City Index in 2018. And it was designed as an index of 50 values. So as you're doing this work and you're looking for issues of justice, you can begin by creating a set of shared values. And to be very precise with your language. Do I need safety, protection, or security? And is my safety, protection, and security different from the young man sitting in front of me, right? Different from the younger woman sitting in front of me. For me being from New York, from you being from Joburg, right? So it does matter to understand and unpack the nuances of this, because a just Joburg is not the same as a just Chicago, or a just Tokyo, or a just New Orleans, or just Buenos Aires, or just Gary, Indiana, right? So it's important that we spend the time to know what we mean. So we've used the index in a number of different ways. I'm a big fan of manifestos. I do this kind of work with nonprofits, with philanthropy, with cities, with organizations. I do it with my students. We do it at conferences. I did it here at WITS in 2018 on a workshop. And it's a really great way to test whether or not, if we were to work together and first create a set of shared values, would we expedite the way we got to a shared vision or shared set of outcomes? Because even though we're different and coming from different spaces, our values often align in ways that we don't realize because we often don't talk about them. We're spatial planners, so we like to get to the spatial solution. But I think the things that we're trying to redress or correct or repair, right, are rooted in a set of values that we hope become present through that work. So this was my way of testing and pushing back on the ubiquitous way the sustainability, equity, and resiliency were popping up, saying you had to be these 12 things or you weren't that. And for me to say, well, hey, what if we were to do this in a more intimate and localized way? What would that produce? And we're tracking this. So when we use the index, we actually do some data to prove the theory that depending on different groups, depending on different contexts, the priorities of values and the issues of injustice are, in fact, a little different. And so this is just two posters from a convening we did on aging and a convening that they do at the GSD called Black in Design. And it's a conference that's hosted by the Black students at the GSD and happens every 2 years. And I won't read it, but in it, you begin to see different populations have different value sets and different priorities for values or different issues of justice that do depend on where you are, that do depend on what age you are, that do depend on what race or sex you are. And so it does begin to daylight the theory that justice can be different and should be different. Third part, enabling futures. So spending some time developing that research lab, and as I said, I sort of had these two pivots. I left SOM as an architect, moved into the public sector, and began teaching at the GSD. What I began to see that was necessary for me if I wanted to address these issues is that I had to be multi-hyphenated. So the reinvention of praxis I just sort of realized that's what I was doing, that I was embracing and integrating multiple forms of theory and creative practice. So I stand here today as a professor of practice, as Mark mentioned, at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where I've also started the Just City Lab, and 15 years ago started my own practice called Urban American City. Urban American City's values are built on disruptive frameworks of policies and practices that produce outcomes designed to break down historic structures and systems of oppression, exclusion, inequity, and access. And we build this on a model of what we call just urbanism, that we want our work, both our outcomes and our designs and our processes, to be restorative. And to be restorative, you must be disruptive. They must be values-based. We must have a cultural competency to work with multiple communities. We must be cross-disciplinary. We must value our expertise alongside of a community's lived experience. We must work grass tops and grass roots. Our work is political because planning is political, and that it requires accountability of all parties. We have a process that is not uniform, but it is rooted in gathering stories, which are about lived experience and data. It is built on setting a collaborative table. We never have a single client. If a single client calls us, like a city, we insist that they set a client table with other sectors. Who's the community leader should be at the client table? Who's the business leader should be at the client table? Who's the faith-based organization who should be at the client table? So that you are not wrestling with a city doing a plan and then getting everybody to agree at the end. Let's get messy at the beginning. We integrate multiple expertise. We work with all sorts of artists and economists and engineers and storytellers to do this work. And our hope is to create innovative solutions and to always figure out a way that we can integrate implementation and a way to measure if we've been successful. The Just City Lab, which is the research lab I have at Harvard, is predicated on that Just City Index. But our proposition is that a just city is where all communities, but especially the least not included, have access to networks and environments that offer the opportunities and resources to be productive and prosperous, advancing their social and economic mobility and agency. We do this through a series of design case studies that we've developed. We've developed case studies around gentrification strategies. We have published several reports mapping America's legacy cities, which is about our shrinking cities. We've done a metric framework on realizing justice in the public realm and public space. As Mark said, we published the Just City essays 10 years ago. We have done exhibitions, and we design tools that are open source for people to use in their work. And so the last part are just a couple of examples of how I've tried to push all of that into the world with the futures I want to see. And so I'm going to return back to land as freedom and talk about ways we want to think about returning and expanding the ownership of land. So back to Chicago and Washington Park and the Black Belt. A lot of what we've been talking about, again, post-2020, is the wealth income gap. And wealth specifically, not just income. So what is wealth? Well, first, what we wanted to see is if current and legacy residents of the former Black Belt that I showed you earlier could pull equity resources like money, land, buildings, time, services, together with larger investors to buy, own, and develop neighborhood land, building, or businesses, and the profits from these assets could be shared by that organization, all investors, including residents. That would be kind of cool, that the whole neighborhood owned its own neighborhood. So we started thinking about wealth in particular, and wealth for families or in household. So for us, Black wealth depends on repairing harmful narratives and affirming wholeness and dignity and access to income-producing work and good health that can accelerate the accumulation and restore the value of asset ownerships like land and buildings and businesses and property and income and savings, enabled by forward-thinking networks of leadership, not one sector, all, that work to eliminate the extractive practices of debt, fines, fees, tuition, loans, predatory loans, so that families can build wealth through financial security that can help them withstand catastrophic shocks. When you ask the average person what wealth is, they typically say it's enough that I am secure, like that I don't have to live. They're not necessarily saying it's $20 million. It's stability. It's flexibility to save or to go on vacation. And it's a freedom such that they can transfer that wealth to future generations and fully participate in economic prosperity. There's also something we wanted to address, which was community wealth. Is there such a thing? And I think that that's probably just a very innate thing that you all understand in ways that we don't in the U.S., because part of the African culture is rooted in community. Your principles, your values, your morals are rooted in a sense of us, not me. That part has been severed for us. So we really want to spend some time thinking about a community wealth model, which is affirming Black cultural production and innovation and self-determinative narratives, where shared power through a democratic governance that amplifies the value of those same anchors and assets, like public space, events, institution, foodways, arts, cultural producers, driven by Black asset ownership, and that the owners of those Black assets can realize a value from it and create their own leadership networks, accelerate their wealth accumulation, their investments in purchasing, business growth, real estate development, shared land and business equity, home ownership, and cultural preservation that produce both economic impact and build stability and pride of place. So two types of wealth are possible, and we've been interested in seeing how we could advance both. So in one part of the Black Belt called Emerald South, we're looking at a way that vacant land is seen not as a liability, but as an asset, because it actually does hold value, even though it's vacant. And that now is a time to recapture that value and protect it from negative consequences like land speculation and cultural erasure, and put it back into productive use. So we started out on this trajectory of Clean, green, beautify, activate, own, and develop. The first part is land care. So how can we take control of that vacant land and just maintain it and be stewards of it and build community through that stewardship, where we could clean a number of lots, stabilize a number of lots, improve walkability, improve a sense of safety, improve safe routes to schools. And then layer on top of that a notion of activation and beautification. What if we could plant, 40 acres of land? What if we can activate it through community organizations and artists and cultural producers to bring a sense of life and vitality back to the public realm? And that's what that one bar I showed you, where there's lots of investment in helping us do those temporary things. We want to get to the third green bucket, which is land and building ownership, where we're increasing the number of Black landowners, increasing the number of Black-owned businesses, increasing the number of lots, reducing the number of vacancy. So we've done over 3 years, on the 4th year now, of activation to stabilizing vacant lots, training and hiring local residents in land care activities of landscaping, demolition, construction. We've done bike rides that are history tours through the neighborhoods. We've done pop-ups of portraits. We've installed murals. We were a part of the Chicago Architectural Biennial. We were a site for that. So there were installations that were a part of the biennial in the neighborhood. But we want to do more. We want to get to that green bucket of ownership. So the thing we're experimenting with is a neighborhood real estate investment trust, or a REIT. This is a common real estate practice. Larger developers own big portfolios of land and they manage that land. But what if a neighborhood organization owns multiple lands, and that the ownership is not just about the real estate asset, but ownership as an agency, meaning the community gets to decide what to buy, what to sell. The community gets to decide how to govern over the land, in addition to being a shareholder. And so this requires different scales of investors. So the resident can invest, and there are ways that these are being set up by a public corporation entity where a resident can invest as little as $100. Different from your typical institutional investor, your big banks, right? Your big funds. And then all these sort of in-between types of investors, anything from a social impact investor or crowdsource investing or institutions like philanthropy. So all of these types of investors are part of the picture. And there are different types of equity that can be introduced. So there could be cash equity, that $100. Families that are aging, whose kids don't want it, they can put their property into it. You can use sweat equity for it. And so there are different types of both individual and community equities that we begin to daylight that show that there are different means that don't have to be monetary that contribute to your contribution of ownership. And then obviously there are different types of properties that can go through different types of iterations of ownership or leasing or renting out that derive income for the REIT. So one of the first steps in socializing this idea, because this has to be something that a community wants to do, to agree that they want to own property together and run an organization with larger institutional players. So we created a Monopoly game. What better way to learn about real estate than Monopoly, right? So we created a really unique Monopoly game for the neighborhood and hosted an event during a planting. These are tulips planted by the artist Amanda Williams. And during the Bloom Day, we set up a number of Monopoly games and had people actually play it. Many of them didn't realize that the land we were planning on was city-owned land, right? And that you could actually buy that land, right? So this connection to place and the understanding of land, something they would pass through every day, a game they had played many times, now kind of synced up. And so you're starting to get buy-in of, hey, this is maybe possible for me. Create receipts. Y'all say that here? Get receipts? Okay, so get receipts on the work. Design structures that assign accountability and measure the change that we want to see. So I'm going to go to Detroit now. So Detroit Like most U.S. cities, went through amazing growth outside of the core, rapid suburbanization and urban sprawl. You all know that quite well. When that happened, the inner city emptied out. In a city like Detroit, though, the inner city literally emptied out. There's lots of vacancy. At the point where I was doing this work about 12 years ago, there were 100,000 vacant parcels, which when we push that together in terms of acreage, is about the size of the island of Manhattan, and 80,000 vacant homes. In the middle of the century, while that growth was happening, the federal government was obliterating Black neighborhoods in the core and creating highways. You all know something about that too, I imagine, right? And so in Detroit, the neighborhoods were called Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. And so from left to right, you will see the boundaries of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. And in the pink, you will see the overlay of the urban renewal boundary for the highway. And then the purple is all the land that was cleared for that construction. 130,000 people were removed. 52, and this was like the hotbed entertainment sort of center of the city. 52 entertainment venues, and 350 Black businesses were eradicated. Here's what the neighborhood looked like. Here's what the clearing looked like. And here's the lovely highway. Now, good news is, during COVID, and the city had been thinking about removing the highway. And during COVID, all of these federal dollars were released to stimulate the economy. So they got approved to remove the segment of the highway that had obliterated the neighborhood. And so here was this chance to do this restorative highway project. And in fact, our last transportation director launched a Reconnecting Communities program that was designed for if cities wanted to remove parts of their highway, they could, and there would be federal dollars to do so. So Detroit was one of them. So yay, this is great. We can restore the neighborhood that was lost. The city transportation department started doing work on this. The community wasn't pleased with the design. They were taking away the highway and replacing it with a 9-lane road that didn't really feel like an urban boulevard. And they asked us to come in to set up a proposition for what it would look like to truly be restorative. So we came up with the 3R principles: reconnect, repair, and restore. And they're rooted on a set of values around people, place, economy, and culture that are very explicit about the restoration of the urban grid and the human scale as a restorative practice alongside of local neighborhood connectivity. The restoration of population growth, because the city had lost so much population, but also the reinstatement of the Black middle class. That the economy needed to grow in terms of businesses, but not just in a traditional economic development model. We had to restore Black wealth as well. And that we had to restore the things that make Detroit, Detroit, and replace the things that made Black Detroit, Black Detroit. So this was the city's transportation proposal, and this was actually the second scheme where they went from 9 to 6. And our city showed them that they really could get to a more urban, walkable street. Because what that does is create a lot of excess land, which creates value. We were also beginning to think about how the value from that land could be put in a fund to also do more reparative and restorative work, like returning housing back to the neighborhood for legacy families that were lost. So we looked at a series of design schemes. The living downtown centered, replace every single house you lost and make housing the focus, right? So that you can bring that population back. The second one focused on cultural heritage, restore the cultural identity. And then the third one looked at the restoration of public open space. And what you'll see here is that a traditional study like this would look at economic impact alone. We set up a metric of looking at reparative impact. And the receipts are the evaluation criteria. And the idea is that you want to make this visible. You want to force a conversation to say, is this lining up to your values and your goals? That's the receipt. So you can see the evaluation of each scheme and how many of them meet the majority of the R3 values. The residential one seems to do the best, the cultural one does the most, and then the sports and rec one does the least. And this gives you a way to talk with communities about what the choices and the trade-offs are that you're making, which is so important in this work. And finally, loud dreaming. Disruption requires us to use our imagination. We were having this conversation, I think, at lunch, that many of us stopped imagining around the age of 3 or 4 when your parents told you to stop talking to your imaginary friend. Right? We're often told, sort of imagination is intentionally disrupted by our parents and our teachers and things like that. And even though we're in a design school and we ideate all the time, I often find we ideate sometime around constraints of practicality and feasibility and sort of normative practices, or just access to things we know in the world. And so I often try to use imagination as a way to prompt myself and my students to think outside of a comfort zone. So one of the ways I did that was in a studio called Legacy Land's Protopian Futures. It was rooted in Indianapolis that had another site of urban renewal, which removed an entire neighborhood called Ransom Place and replaced it with the University of Indiana and Purdue University and a highway, so a very common narrative in the United States. The students did a number of research, but one of their research was to do timeline trajectories of some of these urban renewals and erasures. And to pick a moment in time, let's say they're looking at the highway, and they're at a moment in time where the mayor is making a decision to go with the highway instead of a transportation system. So I asked the students to pick a moment where harm was done through a policy and harm was a decision someone made, and to make a different decision that didn't create harm. So what you see is the top, and you won't be able to read it, but all of it, and most of what I'm showing you, you're going to be able to download for free. So the students pick the moment of harm, and then they do a what-if scenario. So what if the mayor makes a different decision that doesn't obliterate the neighborhood? What does the future look like if that's not done? And I asked them each to write a short story. So the studio publication is called Protopian Stories, and they're in 5 chapters. Protopia and Black and Indigenous American Values, Protopia and Black Power Movement, Protopia and Cultural Reclamation, Protopia and Black Economic Empowerment, and Utopia and Black Healing. And it's a combination of, the mapping is a combination of students' dreams for an area, and then each one has a short story. Each short story is steeped in a design or planning or urban design strategy in the fiction of the story. And then we map an index of those strategies such that a community and a city can actually begin to move into those strategies, recognize what value it's achieving, and continue to unpack the harm that was done through us stepping back and looking at it through a Protopian lens. And then finally, I'll end back with my own work, which was my 2023 Venice Biennale exhibition, Land Narratives and Fantastic Futures, and it takes me back home to Chicago. So still coming off of the initial collages I did for the Chicago Biennale, I'm still trying to unpack and find a way to think about this work through a joyful proposition and the influence of joy in my Black community to inspire me versus using the deficit data to lift me to solution. And so I go back to, Chicago is a very well-known and strong architectural town, and Black architects in the middle of the century were a part of that story. Their history of creating iconography on the south side of Chicago through modernism is very prominent. This is a dry cleaners. That building was a dry cleaners you just saw on the south side of Chicago. Pride Dry Cleaners, to be exact. But even the iconography of the everyday mundane signs, Cermak Plaza Shopping Center, inspiration in the aspiration of that design language. Matusame, Black architect in Chicago. This is a bank building on the south side of Chicago. But what you see is that I'm taking these references and I am reimagining them. The ironwork, not unlike the ironwork you would find in New Orleans, the patterns that are visible, the modernism and I think the creative innovation and the hopefulness in the everyday architecture, I was finding real value in the patterns of my own hair because I grew out my relaxer during COVID and started braiding my hair and haven't looked back. And the interest of reclaiming that and pattern in that medium inspired me as well. And of course, house music. And just I was a dancer in my younger life. And so the movement of body, and if anybody knows a good house party before I leave, I'm down for it. Because I just need 2 hours to move my body, and I am immediately joyful. But house music in Chicago and that liberation is an important inspiration to me. So I also just began to think about, well, who's creating the future? And so I was also inspired by Hebo Brantley's cartoon in Chance the Rapper's video, Angel. Chance the Rapper's mother was my hairdresser, ironically. But I just started thinking about, again, remember I was asking my students to write fiction as a way to get them to imagine. So now I'm interested in superheroes and superpowers to get me to imagine differently. And I started thinking about, well, what if I talked to some Chicagoans about their land narratives and histories, about what wealth means to them, what they think the value of land is, what their superpowers are. How would they use their superpowers for their neighborhood? Well, where does your superhero live? What does his house look like? And that inspired Land Narratives, Fantastic Futures, which is a series of 8 collages from the 8 Chicagoans that I interviewed. So taking that recorded interview, taking references from Chicago's built space and modernism and expressions of optimism, and mashing them together into their superhero collages. We then took the audio recordings, and I was working with a student who was working on sound and 3D printing with clay. And he was developing a program of how he was taking the mapping of the frequency. And I said, hey, so I've got these recordings. I'd really like to create these vessels, the voice vessels of these stories. So we worked and collaborated together. We mapped the audio of the interviews. And so the texture you see on the vessel is the frequency of the interview. And the form is derived from their narrative of their superhero-ness. And so what you're seeing is the robot that does the 3D printing from the program. It is bisque fired, and then we then glaze it. And then you get these 8 corresponding voice vessels that go with each collage. So this is Timothy and his vessel. This is Michonne and her vessel. And this is Father Tolliver and his vessel and collage. We then somehow miraculously give up this all to Venice and install it on a plot of land. And so Venice, trucked in some dirt. We bought some moss, and we packed it with dollars and coins and money to represent the latent value of vacant land. And over time, the moss eroded, and you started to see the value through the dirt and through the acrylic forms that held the vessels, that held an audio of the recording. And so if you walked up to the vessel, it would automatically, you would hear the superhero tell you their story alongside of their collage. So I will briefly play the video of Land Narratives, Fantastic Futures, and then say thank you. No sound. So you're basically going to be flying through each superhero's imagination of their home and how those collections of homes create a neighborhood. The architecture is also referencing their voice vessel in terms of the form. And this is the Washington Park neighborhood that they're flying through. And we'll be ending with Father Tolliver. So what was wonderful about this, and there was a little trepidation when I first started interviewing everyone, but when I started asking about their superpowers, what superpowers they would want to have, how they would use the superpowers to change the neighborhood, it was a really different way of asking a community, well, what do you want to see in your neighborhood? And it was beyond the thing that they knew, it was beyond the limitations of what they could imagine, because they were seeing themselves differently through a lens of empowerment. And so it seems like such a simple prompt, but it was actually quite powerful. So to show them their vessels or their collages and things, just were the sort of awe that they realized that they could inspire something. Is sometimes just the little thing you need to move a community forward. So how will you disrupt praxis and structures to create more just cities? You can find all of this work on either urbanac.city or designforthejustcity.org, and most of the index and our publications are all available for a free download. Thank you.